our next sermon series, our new focus, that we're going to be looking at the early stories of Genesis. And when I say early, I mean early. We're going back to the very beginning, the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And so these are some of the oldest stories ever told. Not the oldest, but getting pretty close. Some of the oldest surviving stories that we have in literature. And you know, when we think about these stories, we call them prehistory because they usually don't have a date that we can pin them down to. Maybe we have theories on when they were written down in their final form, but we don't really know exactly when they started or what time period they are referencing. It's a long time ago. And so as we look at these early stories of Genesis, we have to realize too that even in our Bibles, the stories that we have in our Bibles, those are not the earliest forms because it goes back further. Before it was bound together and compiled in what we would call almost like an anthology, the Bible, they were separate stories that were told to people orally from generation to generation. These beloved stories that people knew. And eventually, over a matter of, I don't know how long, these were eventually written down. And when they were written down, they would have still been separate stories that were written down and preserved. And then when this was all put together into its final form, compiled, edited, and put together in the form that we have it in the book of Genesis, they probably made some changes to the stories as well as they put them in there. And so these stories that we have, and they're not even as old as they get. And so these are, we just keep that in mind. These are ancient stories from an ancient world. And in order to understand them, we have to realize that the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible, Jewish people refer to these first 5 books as the Pentateuch, which is a strange word to us. Those who were in the introduction to the Old Testament class earlier in the year, back when things were normal and we could actually do things together, might remember that word in that study. Penta meaning 5. So Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible. And the first 5 books of the Bible really tell the story of the Jewish people. They tell the story of the Jewish people, how they began, how they formed as a people group, and then how they ended up going to the Promised Land and then ended up in exile in Babylon. And the whole story of these first 5 books is meant to tell their story. Not just to record history, not just to record facts of here's what happened, here's how the universe was created, but it's telling the Jewish story of their people. Many scholars believe that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy may have come to their final form during the period of the exile, when they're living in a foreign land, when their temple is destroyed and everything they know is gone, and they are trying to preserve their history, their culture, and they're also trying to make sense of why are we here? Why has all of this happened to us? And so in a way, the entire history of the Jewish people in the Bible is meant to tell them and to tell others, here's why we ended up in exile. And that's just a reminder to us that we need to remember that history is usually always told for a specific reason. History is usually always somewhat biased and somewhat agenda-driven. Usually we don't tell history simply because we want to record the facts. We probably do that more today than in the ancient world, but still, oftentimes when we're telling history, we have an agenda whether we realize it or not. And that's why history is told differently depending on who is writing the story. Whether it's the victors, the losers, depending on who it is, it's going to be told differently. And so that's important for us to keep in mind as we look at these first stories in Genesis 1 through 11, is to realize that it's Jewish people talking about why they ended up in exile. So history being biased or having an agenda is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, sometimes we think it's a bad thing to have an agenda. It's not a bad thing to have an agenda. The Gospels were written because the people who wrote them wanted people to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. That's an agenda, right? But is that a bad thing? No. And much of the Old Testament was written because the people wanted to know why they ended up in exile. That's not a bad thing, but it can affect how they write it. So when we look at the Jewish story, they connect it to the very beginning of the world. And so we arrive at the first creation story in Genesis. Now, in the first creation story, this is kind of a peaceful, calm story in a way. There's no violence like there is in a lot of the Old Testament and New Testament for that matter. But this is a pretty calm story where God is creating things. He is almost kind of like somebody would enjoy a hobby. Like if you're just going to sit down and paint, if you like to paint. And for people who like to paint or any hobby where you're creating something, it's relaxing to you to be able to do that. And so if you can imagine, almost it's like God is enjoying his hobby and he's going to create something. And my, what a productive week it's been. I mean, holy cow, can you imagine creating the whole universe in a week and still having a day to spare? I mean, that's a lot of work for 6 days. So he gets started, and oftentimes right away we assume that God created everything out of nothing. That's one of the basic beliefs that we have, is that God started with nothing and then spoke it into existence. That's based on one traditional interpretation of Genesis 1:1, and it says this. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And then it goes on in verse 2, "Now the earth was formless and void." And so that's one way that we interpret it. Many of our English translations have it interpreted that way. However, there is an alternative way to interpret this, and they're both valid because it says the Hebrew is uncertain. So many times, if you look in a study Bible, a lot of times you'll see places where it says the Hebrew is uncertain. And it's like, oh, really? And so there's an alternative reading. Genesis 1 could say this. Now listen to see if you can catch the difference. "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void." So it's that little word "when." When God created the heavens and the earth, it was formless and void. Almost presenting a picture where God is not creating out of nothing and just speaking into existence, but that he already has stuff he's working with. I think of a painter who has paper and paint. They already have the stuff. They're still creating something. They're bringing order to the chaos because they're putting the paint in a certain way to make a picture. And so but the materials are there. And so in that reading, the materials are already there. It's just very chaotic. And God's act of creation is an act of ordering and separating. And so he separates the light from the darkness. He separates the waters above from the waters below. He separates to create land. He brings order to things. Which one is right? We don't know. And that is something that's important to keep in mind, because even though that might not really be that big of a life-altering fact for you, it reminds us that even with the simplest of ideas, God creating something out of nothing, interpreting and translating from one language to another is more complicated than we sometimes realize. When the brightest minds in the world are not sure which way that should be interpreted, it leads us to just be aware of the fact that when we read our English Bibles, we cannot necessarily assume that we are reading it exactly as it was meant to be written down originally. And so anytime somebody tries to argue or to make a point by saying, the Bible clearly says, just be a little weary and remember that, their Bible might clearly say one thing, but your different English translation could say something clearly differently. And so just to be aware of those difficulties with knowing exactly clearly what the Bible is saying. But for our purposes, it really doesn't make a difference. Genesis 1:1, God starts the process of creation. And so we go through the days of creation in day 1. And you'll know that in this, the order of creation is based on a very ancient view of the world. So on day 1, he creates light, and he separates the light from the darkness, and he calls the light day, and the dark night. Not to be confused with the sun. The light is not, the sun won't be created for a few days later, but the light, daytime, is created first. Then in day 2, he separates the waters above from the waters below. He creates a dome. And some translations will say firmament, but dome, a solid dome, that refers to the sky. And this sky back then was viewed as being a solid dome. And this dome held back the waters that were above it, hence the blue color of the sky. And so there's water above the dome, and there's also water underneath us. And so we're surrounded by water. See, creation is, in the ancient world, creation was seen as bringing order to the chaotic waters and separating them and giving them boundaries that they cannot pass so that life can flourish. But there's always the threat, there is always the fear that these waters could come crashing down. Waters above, waters below, and that everything could revert back to that original, chaotic, formless void. And indeed, that's what happens in the story of Noah and the ark. But he separates the waters, and he keeps them apart with the sky. And then the next day, he separates the waters below in order to create land, and then vegetation is able to grow. And then in the next day, he creates the sun and the moon and the stars. They don't call them the sun and the moon, they call them the greater light and the lesser light. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the sun is ruling over the day, and the moon is ruling over the night, and the stars, and these things are all fixed within the dome, the sky. And then on the next day, he starts creating animal life. And then after that, on the 6th day, he continues making animal life, but then he finishes by creating humankind. Now this is meant to be the greatest of all his creations. It's how it's supposed to be read. Humankind, male and female, he made them. Now, I know that it's really tempting to try to combine together the next creation story with this one. And so we think of, okay, well, yeah, he created humankind. He created Adam first, and then later he created Eve. So he created the male first, and later he created the female. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's not get into that. That's a different creation story. There's more than one creation story, and they don't agree with one another. And we shouldn't try to make them agree with one another. And here's the thing. There's a lot of theories about why they included more than one creation story in the Bible. Some scholars believe that perhaps these were both treasured stories that were shared for generations. You know, these stories, both of them, and we'll talk about Adam and Eve next week, but both of them teach us something about God, teach us things about ourselves. They're treasured stories told from our ancestors long, long ago. They didn't want to get rid of any of them, and so they kept them both. They included them both. And it's not that they were naive and thought that they agreed with one another. They weren't concerned with that, but they wanted to keep both because they valued both of them for what they could learn from them. And so, you know, sometimes you may wonder, well, which one is true? And I would say, well, they're both true, just not in the way we usually think of in our modern minds. So we'll get into that. But right now, let's stick with the first story in Genesis 1. When God creates humankind, it's almost assumed, the way it's written, that God creates humankind in mass. That it's just people of numerous numbers. Just like when he creates the animals and creates the plants and all these things, then he creates humankind. The Hebrew word for this is Adam, which we pronounce Adam, and we tend to think of it as a proper name. In Hebrew, it's not a name. It's not a proper name. It's a word that means earth or dirt or man, meaning mankind. And so we could, of course, update that language and say humankind, but it doesn't change the meaning of the word. It's saying that they're creating humanity. God is creating humanity. And God says that male and female, he created them in his image. And then on the 7th day, he rests. Now, for some of us, that might be hard to imagine an all-powerful God having to rest after 6 days of work, right? I mean, we don't usually think of God as having to take a day off. But But the further back you go towards the beginning in the Bible, the more you'll notice that people anthropomorphize God. In other words, they give him human-like qualities. They make him more like a person. And so in next week's creation story, God walks around in the garden. God has many of these human-like qualities like the other gods that were around the people in those days. Now, the way they thought about God in Genesis is not the same way they thought about God in the days of King David. It's not the same way they thought about God in the New Testament. It's not the same way we think about God today. But, earlier, the further back you go in the Bible, you read the stories, and you will notice that God does things that later on you read, and later in the Bible, he doesn't do those things anymore. He doesn't have to rest later on in the Bible. And so it's just kind of a different way of thinking about God. So we have this productive week, and I'll have, go ahead and show them the next slide, and I'll have the camera go ahead and focus on that picture real quick. I think earlier in the year I showed this picture too when we were talking about a similar subject, but this is just the viewpoint of an ancient view of the world where there's the earth and there's water, and there's also water underneath and around them and above them. And the sky is a solid dome keeping the water at bay, and the mountains hold up the dome of the sky. Underneath there's the pit known as Sheol, or the Greek word is Hades, but this is the place where people go when they die into kind of an unconscious existence. And so there's always the thread, as you can see in that picture, and you can go on to the next slide now. But you could tell in that picture they are surrounded, they are surrounded by water. This is a scary thing, and at any moment, if God isn't happy, God could send down the rain, send down the water. And so this is a very different view of the world than what we have. And so the question that we obviously want to ask is, how do we read this story? Is this a science lesson for how the universe was created? Some people have and do read it that way, that it is a science lesson in how the universe was created. And so what happens is there's automatically an adversarial relationship between faith and science, because right away science is saying, nope, that's not how it happened. Science tells us this universe was not created in a week. And sometimes people will try to, say, well, maybe days back then were counted differently than they were now. But there's no evidence that actually suggests that. Days were pretty much the same back then as they were now, separated by daytime and nighttime, probably approximately 24 hours. So science says it took a lot longer for the universe to form. It says that the order happened differently. Planets cannot form and take shape unless they are pulled by the gravity of the sun. But in Genesis, the sun is created much later than the earth. Plants are created before the sun is created, for crying out loud. And so science says, whoa, they keep putting up the stop signs and say, wait a minute, this is not what we're seeing here. And it appears as though science does seem to have the upper hand when it comes to describing the world around us. That should not be a disturbing thing to us. But it can be if we view this story as being a science lesson. But science tells us that the universe was not created in a week. It didn't happen in that order. Things happen very differently. And so how are we to read this creation story? Well, when we look at it, we see that it's not actually a science book, that it's not trying to tell us the chief concern of the Jewish people in putting this together with their other stories in the first 5 books. Their primary concern is not, I wonder how the world started. When we look at aspects of this story, this creation story, we actually see elements that seem to be present in other creation stories that were written by people who lived around them in those days. Creation stories that are much older than the story of Genesis 1. For instance, the idea of the chaotic waters that need to be tamed comes from a Babylonian creation story that is much older than this one. And so it appears as though what we see is the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, looking at some of these creation stories around them, and then kind of taking and borrowing and adapting and changing and creating their own creation story. Not that the creation story was only written down when it took its final form. The story was much older than the time of the exile. But still, it appears as though some ideas were borrowed, adapted, changed to create their version of how the world started. Now again, that can be disturbing to you, depending on how you're used to reading this story. Is something no longer inspired if somebody took some of their ideas and adapted them from something before? Boy, I hope that's not the case, because very rarely is it that anybody creates anything nowadays that doesn't have some kind of influence from something that came before it. And yet would we say that a beautiful piece of music is not inspiring because it was influenced by music that came before it? No, of course not. We wouldn't say that. See, what we have here in the creation story is we have the Jewish people wanting to describe how God created the world. And they did it in a form of Hebrew poetry. It's poetry. We lose some of that in the English translation, but it's poetry. The days of creation are symmetrical. There's a rhythm. We see some of it in our English language. On the first day, God said this, and it was so. And God called it good. There was evening and there was morning. The second day, or whatever day. And then God did this, and it was good. There's evening and morning. And it goes on in this rhythm that is very poetic. And so knowing that this story is poetry should inform how we read it. And so in order to understand that, we have to know, what is the purpose? What was the purpose for writing this story? Why did they... Because when we know the purpose, then we can read it with an informed mind. You see, I don't think that it's disrespecting the Bible to say that it is not telling us exactly how the universe was created. I think that we take the Bible seriously when we look at the different kinds of literature within it and then look at, okay, what are they trying to say based on that type of literature and what is their purpose? So what we see with Genesis, for one thing, they're trying to teach us something. And that is that in the creation, God didn't have to kill anyone. That's random. You know, you might be thinking, well, yeah, of course God didn't have to kill anyone. There's nobody there. Who is he going to fight with? It was just God until he created something. No. Now, in the creation stories around them, there were many gods, and oftentimes the creation story was one in which the gods were fighting one another. And in one very well-known creation story, this one god kills the other god. Again, back then, gods had many human qualities, including death. And so this one god kills the other god, pulls apart the body, and one half of the body forms the earth, and the other half forms the sky. Lovely, isn't it? So a lot of these creation stories were very violent, and in our creation story, in the Jewish creation story, they're saying, no. Our God, Yahweh, as they called God, Yahweh, our God is the only God on the block, and so God does not have to contend with any other God in the creation. God just speaks it, and it is. God just does it in a calm, cool fashion. God just creates the universe. God is greater than any of these other things that you might consider gods. And that is why the sun and the moon are not called the sun and the moon in the creation story. They're called the greater light and the lesser light. Some believe that the reason why might be because sun and moon were the names of ancient Near Eastern gods, and that they wanted to declare that these are not gods. Our God is the only God. And God is greater than any created thing that other people might think is a God. And so they called it the greater light and the lesser light, rather than calling it by the names sun and moon, because elsewhere in the Bible, they actually use those names for it. But here, they're wanting to make a declaration. Their God is the only God and greater than anything else that God has created. Another thing that we learn from this story is the goodness of creation and the goodness of humankind. And too often our Christian faith has been guilty of overemphasizing the brokenness and the sinfulness of creation and humanity. So often we hear that we're just dirty, rotten people. We can't do anything good on our own. It is only by God's grace and forgiveness that we are worth anything. And not only us, but the world as well. And that can affect how we treat the world, and that can affect how we treat one another if we think that we're pretty much just kind of rotten and worthless, except for the grace of God. But that's not what they're proclaiming in Genesis 1. God calls creation good. God calls humanity very good. And here's the thing. He knew we would sin. He knew we would sin. He knew that bad things would be done. And he still called humanity good. That's really amazing when we think about it. Because when we think about a child and a parent, when parents have children, they call their child good. And they consider their child a blessing. Now, the parents probably know that the kids are not always going to act good every single day. The parents know that probably there are going to be days when the children make mistakes, when they do bad things, when they sin, when they cause problems, and yet the parent still considers their child good and a blessing. They don't say, oh, they're just no good, they're just not worth anything. No, they still love their children, and their children do difficult things. And in the same way, we are all God's children. And it's not as simple as to say that we are just worthless sinners or to say that we are perfect saints. It's not either or. We are sacred sinners. We are good people capable of great good and capable of great harm. And God created us. We are his children, and he called us good. We are a blessing. And we sin, right? But God knows and knew that we would sin, and yet that doesn't cancel out our worth. It doesn't cancel out God's love for us. God still loves. And that's a message that this creation story tells us, is the goodness of creation. Now, yes, in this next creation story, we'll get into what they call the fall, and when sin enters the picture. But that doesn't erase Genesis chapter 1. That doesn't erase what God originally proclaimed about the goodness of creation and the goodness of humanity. And so, as we look at this, many people are reading this story and using it to argue against evolution, the age of the universe, the way that things were developed throughout the years. People use Genesis to argue against the validity of science in general. And the thing is, it has nothing to say about the subject. It's not even addressing it. It's not even addressing evolution or anything of that nature. It's declaring our God is the only God on the block, or we could say the world. Our God is the greatest. God created everything else that some may assume is a God. No, our God created everything, and creation and humanity has been declared good. And that even though we sin, God's love still reigns supreme, and God calls us good.